Um, I'm your host for today, Anthony Caruana. I'm from Media-Wize. We're a public relations agency based in Melbourne, in Australia. Our focus is really on helping organisations find their stories, tell them really well, and then to share them through the media and through other outlets. So that's our really big focus. I'm joined today by my co-founder and co-CEO, Catherine. Hi, Catherine. And our special guest star for today, David Hollingworth from Cyber Daily. How are you doing, David?
I'm good, Anthony. How are you?
Really well. So just before we start, I just want to acknowledge the country on which we are meeting today. I myself am sitting on Boonwurrung country in the southeast of Melbourne, pardon me. But I want to acknowledge that these have always been lands where people have learnt through storytelling and the sharing of experiences. And that's the spirit in which we're approaching today. We really want to have some time to hear some stories from David, sharing some of his experiences and to learn from each other through the questions you ask and the comments you make. I want to acknowledge all elders past, present and emerging. So with that, I just want to we're going to use the Q&A function if you've got any questions for David as we go through the webinar today. Obviously, we may not be able to get quite to every single question that gets asked today, which is just the nature of things. But if you can ask your questions through the Q&A, we'll do our very best to get to everyone we can. And if there are any we've missed, we'll try to answer them afterwards, but that becomes a volume question. If we end up with 200 questions, it's going to be tough going for us to get back to everyone, but we'll do our very, very best. So with that, David's the deputy editor of Cyber Daily. He's a columnist for Defence Connect, and he's a contributor to Australian Aviation. So let's thank David, firstly, for giving us this hour, but now I'm going to pump him for information and hopefully be able to get as much out of him as possible so that everyone can walk away from today having learned a few things. I'm going to start off. We can't start a talk about cybersecurity without talking about what was broken yesterday with Qantas. We always say in cyber, never waste a good crisis. Always use them as an opportunity to learn. So let's jump into that today. David, how do you think things went yesterday for Qantas? Obviously, we're revealing a big breach, but let's talk about how you think they handled it.
I don't think they could have handled it better. They were fast. They noticed this incident on Monday, and on Wednesday, they were already telling people about it. And on Wednesday evening, they were notifying customers impacted. I mean, that's 36 really busy hours. And I think it's a textbook example of how to do crisis comms.
Yeah. Look, we always say to people when we help them through crisis comms preparation, it is about the preparation. So clearly Qantas had done some legwork beforehand. I don't think they were making this up all on the fly over those 36 hours. It sounds like they were pretty ready for it.
Yeah, I dare say they had canned statements ready to go. They had a playbook to run by. They involved everyone from the CEO on down. It just seemed to be a well-organized communications overall. It was, I got to hand it to them.
Yeah, I think in years to come, people are going to look back at this as a case study in how to do it really, really well. I think similar to how people saw the Red Cross Blood Bank when their incident a few years ago, as opposed to perhaps some of the other more recent incidents that were, perhaps less well handled than what we saw this week.
Yeah, you certainly see some good and some bad ones, and I put Qantas right up there. They pretty much did our work for us. They had statements ready to go. They kept updating the story throughout the day. Yeah, it was good work.
So the other thing that happens after there's been a big incident is obviously the big bang of coverage that happens on the day when the news is revealed. There's always a tail that follows this stuff as people learn more and investigate more, and whether you get statements from federal agencies that are involved in investigations or agencies that are involved in perhaps more punitive measures than just investigation. What's the tail going to look like, do you think, for this one?
Well, it's quite an interesting one because obviously it's big news. Qantas is a national carrier, so looking at it from a purely news point of view, to be perfectly mercenary about it, it's going to get clicks for a while. So we'll cover this more in depth because it is such a big brand. It affects so many people around the country. 6 million people is not a small number. So we'll get the initial statements from Qantas. We'll get the initial statements from cybersecurity experts. We had some yesterday who were beginning to attribute this incident to a known group called Scattered Spider. Then we get So there was another one that did a follow-up this morning. Electronic Frontiers Australia came out swinging, really, saying this isn't good enough. We need to do more to stop these things. They tore into Qantas, and I can understand why. That's their job. But even now, I've got probably a dozen different commentaries from industry experts, from what Qantas is doing well, from what the breach might entail, to what the data might be used for by scammers. So there's lots of interesting stories to tell down the track from that, as well at the same time as watching for that data showing up anywhere. It could be on a hacking forum, could be on the darknet. So we could be telling this story for weeks to come, if not months.
Yeah. We're going to talk a little bit about the dark web and that in a moment. I want to just start with something really simple, because there's a lot of people out here who are wondering, how does the news actually kind of make its way through things? I mean, you'd get flooded with information, really. I mean, I remember from my days as a journalist, getting 300 media releases a day was kind of, that was kind of normal, between media releases, pictures, and all that sort of stuff. How do you go about working out what to actually report on when you're getting all these, for example, you're getting comments on Qantas, but you're also getting stories about other incidents that are going on and so forth? How do you kind of filter through that?
Well, it's basically a triage system. So every morning, my colleague Daniel Croft and I, we get in, we'll go through our inbox, we'll have a look at our various threat tracking feeds that we use, and then we'll start to plan out our news day. Of course, that never survives contact with the enemy. Usually within 2 hours, we'll drop one other story, or another story is breaking, or we've got a notification of another hack. So we get a lot of, like you said, a lot of press releases and reports. Every company is constantly flooding us with, their latest report on ransomware up by this much, payments down by that much. And some of that's really interesting, especially when it's Australian focused. It's always good to get that data out there for our audience. But the one thing we try and do as a breaking news site is we want to cover every cybersecurity incident that we can that impacts Australian companies. So that's pretty much when we drop everything and get onto that.
Yeah, that's probably good advice. I know there's probably a few people here in the PR side of the world or representing vendors and so forth. So that local angle is obviously super, super important.
Yeah.
You kind of mentioned the dark web a little bit earlier, and you talked about threat feeds just in that last answer you gave us. Do you just kind of sit there in your hoodie over a darkened screen, scanning the dark web, looking for bad stuff that's happening? And is that a big part of what you do?
It's oddly accurate, even down to the hoodie. It's winter. I always wear a hoodie in winter. So, yes, correct. But yeah, so we have a number of different feeds. I can name them. Ransomware.live is one of our favorites. Venari X on Telegram is another good one. And these basically do all the darknet tracking for us. So we can come in of a morning and have a look at who's been hit overnight. And it's a volume. Like, it can be anywhere up to 30 or 40 ransomware attacks overnight. Not all of them are going to be Australian, of course, but some weeks there could be an Australian attack every day, and they're particularly busy weeks for us. So these services are on the clear web, but they give us the addresses to go to the dark web and then look at the criminals' websites directly.
So you are actually kind of doing a bit of both. You're kind of looking at using a threat feed to then go and identify something on the dark web and having
Absolutely.
a bit of a dive.
Yeah. So what we'll get an alert. I actually have it timed to my watch, so I wouldn't be surprised if I get a few ransomware alerts while we're having this chat. Then we'll go to these leak sites, which are hosted on the Onion network on Tor. So it's not your average website address. It's not a HTTP www address. It's just this long string of letters and numbers .onion. You can only access it in the Tor browser. You can't access it in the clear web at all. They're highly obfuscated, which is what makes them quite secure and hard for law enforcement to track. And this is where you'll see where the ransomware operators list their victims. These are leak sites designed to name and shame, basically. And often they'll provide proof of the hack. So they'll provide passport scans if they've got them, or receipts or internal emails. So we'll have a look at what they're claiming. We'll have a look at what they say they've got. If it looks like the hack's legit, and 99% of the time it is, that's when we'll reach out to the company to say, hey, this has happened. Have you got comment?
One of the really interesting things when I follow Cyber Daily each day and see what's going on is that you seem to be leading a lot of that coverage. Like, you're finding stuff out first across a lot. I think it'd be fair to say you break more exclusives about Australian companies being breached than almost anyone else in the market here. What are some of the trends and patterns you're seeing? Are there particular things that kind of stand out, or is it just like phishing, ransomware, and that's it?
Probably the biggest trend we see really is that there isn't one. what a lot of the experts say, and it's what I've seen in my experience as well, is what these hackers do is they don't wake up in the morning and go, I'm going to target company X, or I'm going to target this industry sector. That does happen, but that's the exception that proves the rule. What these guys are looking for is low-hanging fruit. The best analogy I can think of is imagine a thief walking down the street. They want to break into a house. They'll see 3 houses with bars in the window. They'll see another house with an alarm system installed. Then they see a house that has none of that. And that's the house they'll choose. Not because that's the house they want to rob, but that's the house they can rob. So these criminals are constantly scanning the internet for internet-facing devices that may not be properly secured, so they can gain access that way. Other times, they're simply going to be cold calling up companies to see if they can social engineer their way into the network. And again, it's not so much targeted as a tax opportunity.
And I remember, like, when I spoke to the late Kevin Mitnick, he said once he got to a person, he almost never failed hacking an organization. He said, if you can hack the people, you can get the organization. I'm just going to throw a question out there. We just got a question from my friend EZ from, I think he's at Deakin Uni from memory. And he asked the question, how often do you see dark web results that companies aren't aware of or that they deny being aware of?
More often than I'd like, to be perfectly honest. And they're two very different things. What I find fascinating is quite often I'll call up a company and they're unaware that something has happened. So normally a normal ransomware attack is going to be very obvious to the victim. Their network's going to be encrypted. None of their systems are working. It's very, very bad. That's not always the case. Sometimes these actors, especially if they're not a ransomware actor, but more of a typical hacker who's just going in to steal data and then sell it on the web, these companies may not know. So we'll contact them and go, "Hey, someone has your data," and they'll be like, "How do you know?" Well, I'm where the criminals are. So yeah, sometimes we definitely have people who the first time they're hearing about this is when we call them. Other times we've definitely had people just flat out denying it. No, we're fine. We got away with it. I've heard that 2 or 3 times now. People say, "No, we got away with it," and it's like, "No, you didn't. I'm looking at your data. You did not get away with it."
Yeah. I have to correct something there. I said EZ was from Deakin. He's actually from Vic Uni, another great fine institution. Thanks for our friends at Vic Uni for dropping in today. EZ, just as a follow-up question, he said, in your experience, are the cyber incident comms prepared organizations looking at the dark web themselves? So the people out there, are they looking?
No, very rarely are these people looking. Look, I think every CISO, in fact, everybody worth their salt who's going to be part of the crisis comms loop in any company should be looking at the same sites we're looking at. They need to understand how these threat actors operate. They need to understand the scale of the problem and the amount of malicious activity that's out there. But most times, no. I've had company CEOs go, "Hey, what's Tor? How do I access the website where these guys are operating?" And it's interesting because usually that's one of the things which is laid out in the ransom note that's left on someone's system, is how to install Tor, how to contact these guys via the dark web, how to use. A lot of them use a messaging service called Tox, highly encrypted, very secure. So everything is there at how to contact them. But I don't think a lot of people in senior positions end up seeing the ransom note. I think that's only people, say, the tech team or the IT team, because you got to remember a lot of the companies that I deal with aren't big. They don't have a security team. They don't have a CISO. They have an IT guy, and even the IT guy is probably just George who knows about computers. Yeah.
I get, yeah, Paul Wallbanks just asked a question. How do you find the standard of crisis comms in these situations? Do you have good and bad examples of how organizations have responded?
Yeah, like there are 2 examples, and I'm not going to name them, but they were within a month of each other, and they were both real estate companies. One, their crisis comms were on top. I called up the receptionist. The receptionist already knew about the incident, so that's great. The amount of times I call up companies, the receptionist has no idea, like that's the first failure. So the receptionist knew, said, "Oh, you need to talk to person X. They're busy, but I'll give them your number and they'll call you back right away." Within 10 minutes, I got that call. The initial phone call was off the record, background brief on what had happened. Then there was an on the record email, and just everything was done smoothly. And it meant they controlled the comms. They were able to say in their initial statement that it wasn't the entire estate agent that got hit. It was one franchise. So they were doing damage mitigation. They came out of it smelling like roses and as the victim of a crime that people would have sympathy for. There was another one which was the exact opposite. This is an example of one of the companies going, no, I think we got away with it. And this one was hilarious. I called this guy up and he just laughed nervously, said, nah, we got away with it. Oh, wait, you're a journalist? And he hung up on me. Then his image and contact number was deleted from the website. And a week later, we got a very nasty email from them asking us to retract what we wrote. But what we wrote was correct. They didn't talk to us. They were hacked. We had clear evidence of it. So they just put their head in the sand. And I dare say that earned them the ire of quite a few of their customers and clients.
So just out of curiosity, did you take the content down?
No. I spoke to my boss. He spoke to his boss. There was nothing factually incorrect in the article. They just didn't like the fact that we called them on it. And that's something that I'm very interested in, as you said earlier, we try and write as many exclusives as we can, not so much to write the exclusives. We just figure that if we weren't doing what we're doing, no one would know the scale of this problem in Australia. Because it's not just the Qantases and the Optuses and the big hacks that make headlines on The Guardian or the SMH. It's small businesses that are getting hit really hard as well. It's retailers, suppliers, distributors in every industry. And I think if we weren't writing about that, people would be unaware that this is happening. An Australian company probably gets hacked two or three times every week, at least. And that's the ones that we hear about. We probably don't even hear about all of them, to be perfectly honest. And in a lot of cases, what we do is force these companies to actually, admit they've been hacked, talk about the problem, and then contact their customers. In quite a few cases, I'm 100% certain a company, if we hadn't contacted them, they never would have contacted their customers. They would have stayed quiet about this and just hoped it all went away, which I don't think is good for anyone.
And that, depending on the size of the organisation, that would probably put them in breach of their the mandatory data breach notification laws, the Australian privacy principles, and who knows what else. Can you just when you call people, do you have like a stock set of questions you kind of walk through when you do that? Is it lifting the skirt a bit too much for you to give us a bit of insight about what those might be?
There's nothing that I want to try and hide in the process of what we do. I mean, we try and be transparent in our journalism and what we write about, and so our process should be transparent as well. So it's really interesting. When I first started, I'd call people up. It seemed the basic thing to do, but more often than not, the person taking the call has no idea what's happening. So it's less than useful. They say they'll take my number, and I'm sure they're not passing that number on, or they don't understand why a journalist wants to contact them about an incident they're not aware of. It's just not the best way to do it. So these days, I will find a contact email, or as many contact emails as I can, and I'll write in all caps, media seeking comment, so it really stands out. And I have a pre-written set of questions and a script, basically, that I just type the details of the incident into. It basically means everybody gets the same set of questions. I get a very consistent set of answers. The most important thing in this as well is letting companies know that if they need time to respond, they should let us know. We are more than happy to wait a day, 2, 3 days if a company in question is dealing with a difficult situation, which we know they are, but then they'll get us comment later. We'll absolutely hold for that, because we believe that a story is more complete if it has the victim's commentary, and we believe that's a better outcome for the victim as well.
Adriana's got a question there. You talked a little bit about monitoring darknet presence and things that are going on there. Do you have any recommendations for organisations with small budgets and limited in-house capability about monitoring these services? I mean, are you talking about, do they just go to an managed security service provider, or is they?
You could do that, but also, I mean, the stuff that we cover costs us nothing. So if you want to be understanding what's happening in ransomware, for instance, ransomware.live, that's the URL to go to. It's run by a guy who does it as a passion project, and it is impressive. It covers every ransomware attack. It has ransomware statistics by country, by date, by year. It has the details of all of the ransomware threat actors, how they operate. It even has examples of ransomware negotiations. which is fascinating to go through. So I would recommend anybody wanting to get an idea of how this criminal ecosystem works to use services like ransomware.live.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I think, often that whole world feels very opaque to the vast majority of people. It's really, really tricky to kind of go, because then as soon as you start talking about, Onion Network and Tor and Tox, all of a sudden it's a level of technical that, I'll be frank, it's a level of technical where when I've played in that world, it's like it's taken up a lot of brain capacity to get there. And not everyone's got that kind of time to go ahead and do that. So that's a really great resource. Thanks for that. How prepared do you think organisations are in Australia for communicating about cyber attacks?
Well, I mean, as we saw with the Qantas, some organisations are very, very prepared. They've done the yard work. They've probably tabletopped these incidents. They've run exercises. They probably do them regularly. They review their playbooks regularly. They can basically go, okay, so what we've hit by ransomware attack. Okay, let's have a look at that. And then they go through that step by step. They know what to do because they've role played out the situation before. I would bet dollars to donuts that's exactly why Qantas was able to act so quickly. Then, of course, there are the ones who just think it won't happen to them. The first time they start learning about ransomware is when they get hit by ransomware, and they're making it up as they go along. And generally, the smaller the company, the more likely that is to be. The larger, the more resources they have to put into that kind of training, that top to bottom training. But smaller companies, they just don't have the money. They need help. I mean, there are things out there like Cyber Wardens, for instance, which is all about empowering small to medium business. But I bet that message still isn't getting across to everybody in every organization in Australia. There are probably organizations out there who aren't even aware that Cyber Wardens exists.
Yeah, I look, to be really frank, my experience is that being able to communicate and get those kinds of messages through to SMBs is it's notoriously difficult. I think state and federal governments for the last 20 years have been trying to do this. And I think their success has been limited at best. It's really hard to get the cybersecurity message across to for example, a team of 20 plumbers.
Yeah, exactly.
But they're really critical messages because they've got payment platforms, they've got customer data, they've got addresses. They'll know when people are in and out of their houses because they're doing capital works or they're doing works at someone's house.
And so that kind of data can be used. A scammer can use that to simply cold call someone and go, "Hi, we're calling about the plumbing work that we did on your property on this date at this time." And they know. So immediately they build trust. They can go, "Oh, look, there was a billing issue. Could you do that payment again? We'll send you some new details." And before you know it, you're scammed out of however many dollars. And that's at the simpler end of how this data can be used by the criminal element. And what I say to people is, if you have a computer and if you're holding data, you're a target. It's just how it is. But the small business mindset, it's all hustle, right? You're doing a lot of work. The average small business owner is wearing a lot of hats, and they don't have the time or energy to wear that cybersecurity hat as well when they really should be.
Yeah. I mean, just a little story. Someone I know suffered an attack, a similar sort of attack like that, and it was literally someone phoned them at home and asked them a couple of questions, and they said, "Oh no, you can't come now because we're going to go and do a doctor's appointment." They stepped out of the house. The house got burgled in that time when they said they wouldn't be home. Phone bills, passports, critical documents like that. And in fact, what they did is they used the phone bill to then go to the phone company, buy themselves a couple of phones, transfer numbers away, access Google accounts and delete, all sorts of stuff. Like the impact on that was massive. And that was just one person. You can imagine the impact of that on a business. And I think that, when you talk about some small businesses, they're holding stuff in spreadsheets that are completely unprotected, on open file shares because that's easier for dealing with people. There's all sorts of stuff like that goes on.
Yeah, so I had an interesting incident I was tracking, I think last year. It was a company in New Zealand, and they were great. I contacted them. They provided commentary. They confirmed that they were investigating it. And I wrote about the hack, and I mentioned some of the data that was compromised that included credit card scans. This is something I see all the time. And then I got a call, not from the company, but from the security company that was remediating the incident, and said, "We've not found any credit card data. Where are you finding this?" And I went, "Oh, there are credit applications, like A4 scans of credit applications that have credit card scans in those applications." And he gave the most depressed sigh I've ever heard as he realized he would have to go back through all of this data again to find each one of the individual ones. So that's the other issue, is that a lot of companies don't know what data they're holding or where they're holding it. So when these incidents happen, trying to work out what the exact damage is so hard, and it takes a long time. It can take months for a company to work out who's been impacted, which, going back to Qantas again, they did it within 24 hours. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, that's pretty unheard of. And, not just to be able to say you've been pinged, it's your name, address, and it's like, I imagine almost everyone on this call has been a Qantas customer at some time and probably got one of those emails yesterday.
Yep.
The details exactly what it was. I know I got pinged in another breach years ago with Scouts Victoria, and they gave me a list of all the things that they were taking and that was pretty horrific, because there was a lot of data they shouldn't have been holding in the first place, which is probably a good lesson for a lot of businesses. Don't store stuff you don't need to hold.
Absolutely.
And verify and delete.
Yep.
Is probably a good rule. Let's talk a little bit about transparency and damage control. Because for some people, they think damage control is say nothing. And then for others, it's damage control is being open and honest, perhaps even to a fault. So there's a bit of a balancing act between those things. How do you think companies ought to balance that because they obviously want to be honest with their customer. Well, they obviously should be honest with their customers. But also they need to protect their reputation during a cyber incident. How do you see them balancing those things?
Well, I think truth is always the best defense. If you've been impacted by a cyber incident, say you've been impacted by a cyber incident. I mean, I grew up in a period where bank robberies were common, and they were big news items. And, if you're robbed, you call the cops, you say, hey, you were robbed. Cyber incident really isn't any different. It's a digital robbery. So you do need to report that to the proper authorities. You do need to be open about it. And it's also going to be a newsworthy thing. People want to, it's a breaking news environment. I believe it's public interest journalism. For a lot of readers, I'm sure it's kind of like, ooh, they got it hacked. Oh, that's kind of interesting. So it has that kind of viral thing to it. But speaking of how companies should react, I think one of the worst things that a company can do is not talk about it. The worst thing that can happen to a company is one of their customers reads an article of mine, finds out that company X was hacked. They've not heard anything about it. And all they see is the company didn't comment. As opposed to reading that same article where the company says, yep, we're aware of it. We've contacted the Information Commissioner. We've contacted the Cybersecurity Centre. We've hired external experts to help us with the thing. And here's what's happened. And we're doing our best to stop it. And here's advice for what you should do if you think your data has been compromised. I mean, that's just due diligence to me.
It's interesting too, because when you're sort of talking about the protection of reputation, I mean, I don't think the banks ever really worried about what the impact on their reputation would be when they got robbed.
No.
They didn't kind of think of it that way. Now, do you think there's like an element of almost like embarrassment, like we let them in because they got, is that the difference? Because like with a bank, like unlike you, I grew up in the days where, banks got robbed. In fact, my sister worked at a bank during an armed robbery.
Yeah. I witnessed one when I was a kid.
Yeah, so most of us have got that experience of ever having heard of one or seen them on the news and that sort of stuff. But the banks were never embarrassed because it was always the bad guy's fault. Like they were the one that walked into the door with the weapon and threatened to take the money. Whereas with cyber, there seems to almost be like it's a mistake you've made, and sometimes people are lax with their security. But do you think there's an embarrassment or a social anxiety thing to it?
I think that's absolutely correct. With a cyber incident, there's very likely some fault in the organization that has allowed this criminal to gain a foothold in that network. So it could be via social engineering, Kevin Mitnick's favorite thing, and very likely what happened to Qantas is someone just tricked their way into the network, and once in, they're able to take data.
I guess when you sort of think about that, because you're talking about we made a mistake and they got in. But like if you look at, for example, I'm going back a little bit now. If you think about like the Target breach in 2013, I mean, at the time, no one thought that going in through the air conditioning system was going to get you to the point of sale.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And they got pilloried for that. And I think this, you know, the people lost jobs. There was, you know, big regulatory action and everything else. Is that really a thing where, you know, is it? I guess I'm getting at it. Is the complexity of the attack sometimes understated, and that makes it more embarrassing?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, we know, for instance, that scam reporting in Australia is we only see the tip of the iceberg. And I would say attacks like this are very, very similar. There is definitely a hint of embarrassment. It's one thing to be robbed at gunpoint. It's another thing to have accidentally left the digital door open and let hackers into your network. But at the same time, what I think most people don't understand is that this is what I heard when I first started covering cyber, and I've heard it non-stop, and I absolutely 100% now believe it. It's not a matter of if you're going to get hacked, it's when. And so if Optus, Medicare, Qantas, all of these big giant brands that do have massive security teams can get hacked, anyone can. And I think we just need to understand that that is the world we live in, sadly. The criminal ecosystem is broad and deep. They are technically proficient, both digitally and socially. And if they want to get in, they're going to get in some way or other. What defines an incident like this is how the company responds.
So do you think there's an element of victim blaming that goes on more broadly?
Definitely, yeah. You know, so it's one thing, you know, to go back to that bank robbing analogy. You know, it's not your cash that's getting stolen, it's the bank's cash, and that's always covered. You never have to worry about your money. But in a data breach, it is your data. It is personal. It is your name and address. And it's because of the follow-on threats that we were just talking about of scammers using stolen data to scam money out of you, of stolen credentials feeding into another downstream attack. A data breach is a lot more sensitive. And also, it's big numbers. You know, 6 million Australians could be affected by this hack. That sounds huge. It sounds impactful. But what a lot of people also need to remember is that that kind of data is often voluntarily given. So I signed up for Frequent Flyer. I gave over all my details. Anytime you sign up for any loyalty reward program, you're the product. So those names, details, addresses, they're out there on multiple systems waiting to be breached multiple times.
Yeah. In fact, before we started the webinar, we had exactly this conversation, didn't we? We were talking about loyalty programs, and I said, my feeling is that I don't engage in any loyalty programs anymore because my trust level is low. Like after 15 or 20 years of hanging around the cyber world, like, you know, my trust but verify radar is very, very strongly on the, my trust is pretty low on most systems because it's just a simple fact. It's not the if, it's the when. So you try to reduce your footprint, if you like. Yeah. Let me ask you a question. Just we've got a question that's come in from the audience. I'll just ask you one thing before we go there with Adriana's question. You've written a lot of stories around this, around this area in cyber. And often the response that we get from either through PR or through you know, direct responses from the people who have been hit is they talk about it was sophisticated.
Yeah.
How often is it really sophisticated, and how many times is that just a word that's thrown in there to try to placate the audience?
I would say most attacks of this kind are a combination of very simple techniques and very sophisticated techniques. The simple side is the social engineering. You pretend to be from technical support, so you say, "Hey, I'm from technical support for this company," or "I'm representing your managed service provider." You say all the right things, and you manage to trick someone into downloading a remote desktop platform kind of thing. And before you know it, that's when the sophistication starts. That's when they start to move laterally through the network. They're deploying malware from their own malicious infrastructure. They're exfiltrating data, often fast, often slow, depending. So yeah, it's a combination, but often it's the simplest thing that gets them in through the door. Could be stolen credentials, could be tricking someone into installing that kind of remote access software. So it's a combination.
Yeah. In fact, if you look back at the Uber breach a few years ago, that was that breach in particular was really interesting because the account that was breached had multi-factor authentication, but they just ping the person with so many multi-factor requests that eventually the person just hit yes, either by accident or through, for what they call it, fatigue.
MFA
and they
fatigue,
let
it's
them
a real
in,
thing.
and the bad guys were off to the races inside there.
Yeah.
Just a point made by Adriana. She said, in-person bank robberies, the banks had incident response plans. They had a staff playbook. Like, if a bad guy walks in, here's what you do.
Yeah.
Do you think there's enough of those incident response playbooks on the cyber thing? And do you think that they actually go into sufficient detail to cover not just the technical element of the attack, but the full response to an attack?
Often they do, especially if they've brought in an external person to, say, run tabletop exercises for them. So they get the board involved, they get the IT team involved, they get the legal team involved, they get comms, they get everybody involved at every level of the company. So there's no real surprises. And while some companies very likely have detailed playbooks for every kind of incident, just having one playbook, one general playbook, is enough to get you a head start on what to do when this kind of thing happens. Immediately, are you willing to pay a ransom? Like, there's the big one, for instance. That question should be answered before you ever get attacked. No, we won't. Yes, we will, because that defines everything about the rest of your response plan. These are questions everyone needs to know the answer to.
Yeah, that one's a really interesting one. When we've worked with organisations, it's one of the first things we ask them in their crisis training is, if you are hit with a ransom, would you pay, yes or no? And it's really interesting because you get some very nuanced answers in that. Sometimes you get a straight yes, sometimes you get a straight no. But there's a lot of it depends.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And you need to know what the factors are inside that it depends as an organisation.
You need to know what data you're holding. The crown jewels is what a lot of experts call it. What are you protecting and what's at stake if it does get breached? One incident I recently covered, the company literally had no idea what they'd lost. They just didn't understand that this data was even accessible. So they were completely unaware. They were caught completely flat-footed, and they certainly did not have a playbook to run through. And that playbook should absolutely include, what do we tell the media? What do we tell our customers? So again, going back to Qantas, they had all of that ready to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Easy from VU, Victoria Uni's got another question for you. What do you think would happen if organisations were more open about the response, remediation and recovery story to cyber incidents impacting them? Do you think that people are too focused on reactively controlling the narrative? Would you pick up a story that came to you with that kind of humility?
Absolutely. A story is a story. And if we want to try and cover the length and breadth of cyber attacks in Australia, that's definitely something we would cover. And I would say that's pretty much what Qantas has done. We didn't have to track them about that. They didn't need to be asked. They controlled the narrative from the get-go. And I think that's going to work for them very, very well in the future. Apart from the EFA boss, I don't think too many people are angry at Qantas over this. And I think that comes down to the fact that they have been humble about it. Like, holy shit, this happened Monday. By Wednesday, they're admitting it. And by Wednesday night, they're already telling their customers. They know what's happened. I would say it's been a very humble response, honestly.
Yeah, I think, it is one of the best ones. Interestingly, have they actually apologised directly for the incident, or have they said, have they just expressed regret? I want to say just expressed.
Let me just check my email, because I should have it open. Important update for Qantas, because I was just writing a story on exactly this. So, and it ends, again, we are deeply sorry this occurred. Our focus is on doing all we can to support you. And that's directly from, in theory, Vanessa Hudson, the CEO, whose signature is on that email. So again, it has that very personal side to it. Like, it's the CEO reaching out to you, and it isn't. Let's be honest. Someone's wrote that for Vanessa to sign, but still, it's a very, very good look, because it's a personal apology straight from the boss. Can't ask for more.
One would expect that the CEO putting their name to something would have at least read it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which means that they're behind it and they own it.
Yeah. And also, it's Qantas. Qantas has had enough bad press recently that here's something they can control, and they're doing a great job of it.
In the time you've reported over cyber, the regulatory environment's changed quite a bit. I know we've had the AP, the privacy principles for a long time, but we've seen notifiable data breaches, and other rules have come along, and I think people are a lot more aware about standards like ISO and ISO 27001 and NIST and all that stuff, Essential 8 and so on.
Yeah.
What role do you think regulation's playing in how they respond to cyber incidents? Do you think are the laws changing the way they report and manage breaches?
I'm not seeing a huge impact on how companies are behaving in the wake of a breach. It'll be very interesting to see the impact of the mandatory ransomware reporting rules. Ransomware payments do seem to be dropping generally, but they are still being made. I can tell most of the time when a company's paid a ransom because I'm looking at the leak sites, right? And that entry will disappear. There's only one reason a hacker will take down that entry. That's because the victim's paid. And in the past, I know victims have not gotten back to me. They've decided to white knuckle it out, pay the ransom, and wait for the story to go away. Now they can't do that. If they pay a ransom, they need to report it. And because it is easy to track these, in some cases, track these ransom payments, if a company pays a ransom and doesn't report it, they're going to cop it. And I think that's good. The reason we need to understand the number and amount of ransoms being paid is we need to understand the scope and scale of the problem. So that's an area where I think regulation definitely helps. But the problem is regulations aren't there when the incident happens. It's all post-incident. So there's only so much the government can do in this regard, I think.
Yeah, look, and regulation's really interesting because regulation's not just what you should be doing; it's the least that you should be doing.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important point to make. It's that when you follow a standard, it's a minimum standard. It's not the maximum standard. There are always minimums.
Yeah.
Let's just have a chat about the state of cybersecurity journalism in Australia, just a little bit. I know you're out there with Daniel, and you guys are reporting on it pretty much full time, 24/7, almost 24/7, because sadly the bad guys don't go to sleep.
No,
They're always
and
awake somewhere.
we have commonly worked on the weekend on evenings if something big happens and we want to break it. So yeah, it is absolutely 24/7.
So I mean, when I was reporting on cyber almost exclusively, I think there was probably 5 or 6 of us that were running around the country, attending cyber events, following stories, here, overseas, and whatever. That seems to be a much smaller number of dedicated cyber reporters in Australia at the moment. Do you think that that's impacted the quality of the reporting or the quantity of reporting?
I think so, because you look at, so for instance, the perfect case in point, the other week when that big 16 billion person data breach broke the news, and it wasn't a data breach. It was old data that had been collected. It's basically what's called a combo list. And combo lists are shopped around on dark web and clear web hacking forums really commonly. And all the mainstream media brands and some of the smaller ones were calling this a data breach. And it wasn't. It just old data. That's all it was. Was it a huge amount of it? Yes. Was it new? No. And that was very poorly reported on. In other instances, there are some really good, we're obviously not the only cybersecurity journalists in the country. There are some really, really good ones that have been doing this for far, far longer than I have. I've only been doing this for seriously for about 4 years now. But it's the mainstream media that often get things wrong because they don't understand the nuance of it. The SMH will only write about a data breach when it is an Optus or a Qantas or a big company like that. They ignore everything else. So that means they're not writing about this constantly. They don't understand the ins and outs. And there is a lot of nuance to it. There's a security analyst who I won't name, but his modus operandi is to look for open servers and open data repositories, contact the company, and then he'll write a story and ship that round to media as well. And the media don't know what they're reading. All the media sees is, there was an open Amazon bucket with 4 million sets of credentials in it. That's a data breach. And they report it as a data breach. But it's not. It's not even a data leak because there's often no proof.
It's an ethical reporting.
It's ethical. That's really all it is. But yeah, this guy tends to shop it around as something which is newsworthy, and half the time it isn't. So yeah. The reporting could be better from the mainstream, but as usual, it's the dedicated publications like Cyber Daily and I would rate IT News and others as well, who I think do the better reporting on this.
Just when you talk about combo lists, and that was a really interesting, sideway there. segue there. When you talk about those combo lists, what we need to realize is that there are literally tens of billions of leaked records, pardon me, available on the dark web now. Now, we all know that they're all out there. And the big thing that's changed over the last couple of years is the wide scale availability of AI. Do you see that there's going to be a big coalescence of those two things coming together to make those kind of combo list stories perhaps a little bit more serious, or have a lot more impact on individuals?
It's entirely possible in theory. I don't think anyone's using AI to exploit the huge amounts of data that's out there at the moment. The way AI is being used in the criminal ecosystem is mostly when it comes to scamming and phishing and things like that, because only like a few years ago, you could tell a scam message when you got it on your phone. It'd have really rotten English, punctuation would be terrible, all of that. Now, you can just go to ChatGPT and get it to write it for you, or any other AI, or even like there's Dark GPT out there, which is dedicated to this kind of stuff, and it will write it in perfect English. It will even aggregate brand logos and stuff like that. So AI is definitely in use, and it's definitely accelerating what these threat actors can do. But in terms of mining the data, we're not seeing much of that yet, but it's entirely possible.
EZ from VU's got another question for us. What are the most common roles you see as spokespeople for cyber incidents? Is it CEOs, CISOs? Is it just a generic response from a media app mailbox? Who do you see as the main respondents?
It's all of the above. When we get commentary, it's usually requested to be attributed to a spokesperson. In some cases, it'll be the CEO or director who what have you will want to make it personal. And there's pros and cons to both approaches. Often I will contact a company, and then within an hour, I'll get a call from people I know very well at various crisis comms agencies like Atmos or legal firms who have been brought in and said, hey, we're now representing this client. And that always makes me happy, because I know that these guys are professionals. I know they'll be telling the victim what they should be doing, and 9 times out of 10, the victim will follow that advice. And they'll be crafting the response, but that response will be on behalf of a company spokesperson. So and sometimes it's their media department. Sometimes the media department just moves my query on to someone more senior, which isn't a bad thing to do either, because often it's very serious questions and a very serious incident they're trying to talk about. So yeah, CEOs, CISOs, media liaisons, all of the above.
Awesome. Hey, I've got a curiosity question, which is, and I love asking journalists this question when I talk to them. What's the best story you've broken? What's been your most favorite story you've broken?
Gosh, that's a hard one. I think one of my favorites, this is one of the first big dark web stories I broke. I've got to tell the entire story. It's kind of funny. I was leaving the office to go to lunch, and as I said earlier, I get alerts on my phone, and an alert popped up, and it said that a game developer, Insomniac Games, had been hacked. And I turned around, I went back to my desk, I had a look at what data they had, and boy, did they have a lot of data. This is the game that was developing the Spider-Man games. It was working on a Wolverine game at the time, and the ransomware guys got everything. And so within minutes of it hitting the dark web, I wrote a story because I knew the gamers would be interested in this, and I knew the gamers would make it go viral. And that's the biggest story our site's done, I think, ever, because it made it to Reddit, made it to Kotaku. Every time something happens with gaming, I'll try to cover it as fast as possible, because gamers are a great audience. Another one is so this is a bit weirder. There is a fan fiction website called An Archive of Our Own. It actually won a Nebula Award a few years back just for the collective work. And it is terabytes of fan fiction. And it got hit by a DDoS attack by, I think, a Islamic hacking collective. And these guys targeted Archive of Our Own because a lot of that fan fiction is queer fan fiction. And it was, so the site was taken down right when people would be getting home from work in the US. And so I wrote the story, and again, it went off. And I had my boss going, what's Archive of Our Own, and why do people care? And so I had to explain to him what fan fiction was, why I know about it, and because I've got work on there. Yeah, and again, so those stories are just knowing that there's an audience out there that wants to know what's happening and why. So yeah, those stories are always fun. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure my daughter's written for that site as well and
Yeah,
had some
there you
stuff
go.
on there.
Yeah,
But it's really interesting because it goes to who cares when a particular attack or particular breach happens.
yeah.
And it's not always about PII, and it's not always about corporate, but it's actually a lot of it's lifestyle. You know, when you talk about things like gaming and fanfic, you're actually hitting people, you know, where it really hurts in their personal lives. Far more, you know, I mean, I'm skeptical enough now to believe that pretty much everything about me has been stolen somewhere at some point.
Yeah.
But you know, when you start hitting people on their creative side or on their lifestyle side or whatever, that's a very different kettle of fish.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, my humble brag is that I wrote a story once about the CEO of a cybersecurity company, and they weren't very truthful in their interview with me. And my headline was asking the question about whether they were dishonest or delusional. I got disinvited from all future events from that organization. But it's really, really interesting when you talk about how people react to particular stories.
Yeah, it's just knowing, in that case, it's just knowing what story to pick and knowing that it's the right time. You know, there's a lot of international hacks that we don't cover. In fact, we couldn't. There are just literally too many. If anybody does go to ransomware.live, like stay on it day by day and have a look at how many victims are added each morning. Like it will open your eyes, I guarantee it. Yeah. But some things are just worth covering.
I feel like you know, sitting there and watching that feed would be a mixture of, you know, morbid curiosity and complete fascination
it
about
really
just
is.
you know, the volume and the variety of things that are happening out there. We've almost come to the end of the time that we've had. I just want to just check in if any of the people who are online have any more questions. We'll just give people a moment or two if they've got a question. But I got to say, I mean, you know, when we do webinars, obviously there's a bit of preparation that goes on ahead of a webinar where we sort of think about some of the questions we want to ask. But obviously with Qantas happening yesterday and the questions that are coming from the audience, it's been a really, really interesting and we certainly haven't followed the script. I'm going to tell people out there that
no, we haven't at all.
We did have a handful we had about a dozen questions lined up, and I think we've kind of hit them directly or indirectly, but it's been a fascinating discussion to kind of roll around. Someone is typing. I'll just wait until that message comes through.
I think Adriana has something to say.
And Easy has something
to
tap in.
Excellent.
No question. Oh, there you go. It's a thank you. Yeah, we thank you as well.
Thanks, Adriana.
Well, maybe with that, we might let everyone off the hook a little bit early because we've kind of hit the end of close to the end of time and hit our questions. Look, for all the people out there, thank you so much for making the time today. We really do appreciate it. I know it's sometimes it feels a bit easy to attend a webinar because it's just an hour. You sit at your desk, you can, you know, munch on your sandwich or your lunch or whatever while you're doing that. But we do appreciate everyone giving up their time to do that today. Most of all, I want to thank David for his enthusiasm in being involved in this. A couple of people asking if we're going to share the recording. Yes, we will. So you'll get an email from us in the next few days with a copy of the video and a transcript and all that sort of stuff. So just to everybody, thank you very much for your time. We really do appreciate it. Thank you so much, David. Thanks, Catherine, for your support and getting this all happening as well.
Thanks for having me. It's been fantastic.
And with that, thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and I hope to catch up with you all soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, Ron.